Tidewall is built on a contradiction. It sits at the edge of the Ethres coast where the river Neri meets the open sea, and everything about it runs on the tension between those two things, the fresh water pushing out, the salt water pushing back, and in the pressure between them, the resonance. Steam engines drink that pressure, resonance conduits channel it. The whole city is a machine that learned to breathe, and for 400 years it has breathed without stopping, and most people who live inside it have stopped noticing the sound. Lyra Feris noticed it every day. She grew up in the flooded districts. That's the part of Tidewall the city maps label as the tidal quarter, and the people who live there call the soak, where the buildings are all a story taller than they need to be because the ground floor floods twice a year and everyone knows it and builds accordingly. Her mother was a river healer, not guild certified, not registered, the kind of practitioner who operates in the space between the medicine the guild provides and the medicine people actually need at 3 in the morning when they can't afford guild rates. Lyra learned to read a pulse before she learned to read text. By the time she was 12 she had assisted at births, set fractures, and sat with people while they died in the particular way that river folk died, which was quietly and without the institutional comfort of a guild ward. She got into the guild academy on a scholarship that the admissions board awarded her with visible reluctance and then immediately forgot about, which suited her fine. She didn't need their enthusiasm, she needed their library. This is important. Beyond traditional medicine, the guild trained their surgeons to treat magical afflictions. Lyra Feris was not the kind of person who wanted to prove anything to the guild. She wanted to learn what the guild knew and then go back to the soak and use it. That was the entire plan. Clean, simple, practical. Then something huge happened and the plan stopped matching. The morning of the rupture she was in the academy's third-floor ward doing post-operative checks on 2 engineers who'd come in the night before with standard ether exposure, routine work, the kind of work that her supervising senior, a guild-certified practitioner named Holt who had been certified for 11 years and had used exactly the same diagnostic approach for all 11 of them, considered appropriate for a second-year student. The explosion came through the floor. Not the sound. The vibration. Tidewall's resonance infrastructure runs through the city's foundation the way veins run through a body, and when the western conduit went, the whole city felt it in its bones. The ward windows cracked. One of the engineers woke up shouting. Lyra was already moving toward the door when Holt grabbed her sleeve. She looked at his hand on her sleeve. Then at his face. "Where do you think you're going?" he yelled. "They need healers, not nursemaids," she replied. "What they need are experienced healers," he says furiously. Lyra pulled her arm free. She said, "It's a good this I'm heading out there and leaving you here to continue your duties." She was already sprinting before he finished the next sentence. She didn't hear what it was. She's thought about it occasionally since then and decided it doesn't matter. By the time she reached the Western District the smoke was reading wrong. She noticed this before she noticed anything else. Not the casualties streaming toward her, not the collapsed bridge sections, not the sound of secondary steam venting through cracked conduit walls. The smoke. Resonance fires burn a specific color when the ether content is high, a blue-gray that the guild's field manuals describe as indicating dangerous atmospheric saturation, and the smoke above the Western District was that color from horizon to horizon. This meant the air itself was medically saturated. This also meant respiratory exposure was a secondary injury vector for everyone in the collapse zone, including the rescue teams, including the healers. She stopped running for exactly 15 seconds, processed this, and redirected to the field supply depot 3 blocks east before continuing. She arrived at the triage zone carrying 12 resonance filters she'd requisitioned with her academy credentials and the particular expression of someone who is not interested in being told no. The triage tent had already collapsed under the sheer volume. She looked at what was in front of her, the boy missing the lower half of his left arm, the dockworker with resonance burns covering 60% of his torso, the 3 children pinned under fallen steel that 2 rescue engineers were trying to lift with equipment that wasn't rated for the weight, the 2 guild researchers sitting against a wall with the gray skin and dilated pupils of advanced ether poisoning. And she divided it into a sequence, not because she was calm, because panic is expensive and she couldn't afford it. She went to the ether-poisoned researchers first because they had minutes. The boy's wound was already field-wrapped by a rescue worker and was holding. For now, the children needed the steel moved, not a healer, and she flagged a 3rd engineer on her way past and told him specifically what she needed him to do and what equipment to use, and he did it. The dockworker's burns were severe, but burns don't kill in the first hour. A healer from the guild's formal response team appeared at her shoulder saying something about protocol. "Pulse is weak," she said, "resonance collapse." She held out a stabilizer, sealed the secondary pathway first. Protocol bridges can wait. 6 hours went like that. She doesn't remember most of it in linear sequence. She remembers specific images, the color of a particular resonance burn, the weight of a child she carried 20 meters to the surgical station, the precise moment she ran out of stabilizers and started improvising with the ether filter materials because the chemical compound was similar enough to work if you knew what you were doing. The guild's field manual said you shouldn't do that, but this was the field and that was Mosolt's scholarly resolution. By sunset she had personally stabilized 32 people. She was kneeling beside the 32nd, a young bridge engineer named Petra whose internal resonance lattice had partially collapsed from the blast exposure and who was going to survive because Lyra had spent 40 minutes rebuilding the lattice using a technique Lyra had invented just 45 minutes ago out of structural necessity, when she heard a voice behind her. "You bypassed standard reconstruction protocol," it said. She didn't turn around, she was finishing the lattice. "He survived, didn't he?" she responded. "That's not what I asked," the voice again with arrogance this time. She knew the type. It's the same tone she hears every day, dripping with condescension and frostbite. She finished the suture on the external resonance pathway, checked Petra's pulse, strong, steady, improving, and then turned around. She had known who Vaelor Dutton was before she ever speaking to him now, the way everyone at the academy knew who Vaelor Dutton was, which is to say by reputation first. The reputation: Grand Surgeon at 29, youngest in guild history, Viscari nobility, 3rd house, with significant political weight, published methodology that had restructured how the guild approached ether poisoning treatment, prodigy, heir, legend adjacent. The reality of him, standing beside her operating table in a coat that cost more than 3 months of her academy stipend, looking at her patient with the expression of a man running a diagnostic on something he hadn't encountered before, tall, dark-scaled at the jaw and collar in the pattern of old Viscari bloodlines, and watching her with an attention that had nothing performative about it. He wasn't checking her credentials, he was reading her work. She'd met people who looked at her work before, they typically looked for the errors. Vaelor was looking like he was trying to learn from this. It was unusual. "Would you like a lecture?" Lyra asked. "I would determine if you're lucky," he said plainly. "And if I'm not?" Lyra stood straightener before him. "Then everyone would have to get ready for multiple case of blood poisoning in multiple patients." He sat down, uninvited. She handed him their chart. Refusing felt petty and she was too tired for petty. She explained the procedure and her approach. He listened without interrupting, which she noted because in her experience men in expensive coats rarely listened to women like her without interrupting. He asked 4 questions at the end. All 4 were smart questions. She answered them honestly, including the one about the ether filter improvisation, which should have made him reach for a protocol violation report. With honest curiosity in his tone, he asked, "The rate of corruption, did you calculate it exactly or estimate it?" She reached over to turn the sheets on the chart, revealing equations beneath. "It's calculated. I have the working on the supply manifest if you want to verify." He reads on, "I'll want to verify." She sighs and leans back in her chair. "I assumed you would." Neither of them liked the other, that was clear. It was also clear that they were going to have to keep talking, because they were both looking at the same patients and coming to the same conclusions. Some techniques that shouldn't have worked according to the guild's existing framework are getting the jobs done in trauma settings, which meant the framework was wrong, and wrong frameworks are interesting to a specific kind of mind. They were the same specific kind of mind, that was the problem. 3 hours later the eastern tunnel ruptured. Secondary collapse. The initial blast had compromised a load-bearing conduit wall that the rescue assessment had missed, which was a bad habit of initial assessments. The eastern tunnel came down on a rescue team, 12 people, 2 guild surgeons, 3 engineers, 4 rescue workers, 3 civilian survivors they just extracted, and 1 Vaelor Dutton, who had gone into the eastern section to run a structural resonance assessment and had been doing so when the ceiling decided to stop being a ceiling. Lyra ran the scene when she arrived. 6 tons of structural steel distributed across a tunnel space approximately 4 meters wide, blood visible under the debris, a significant volume, definitely arterial. 2 guild healers standing at the edge of the collapse looking at each other with the specific expression of people calculating odds and not liking the result. She heard one of them say, "We need a surgeon." She rushed over, dropping to her knees at the edge of the debris and said, "Move." They stared at her, and she saw the hostility start to creep into their eyes, even now. "Move," she repeated. One of them grabbed her shoulder. "You're not even a full-fledged healer yet," he said. Lyra pointed at the blood spreading under the steel. "Do any of you have any better ideas? He is dying." The one grabbing her started, "That's not the point." She shrugged off his hands. "Then your priorities are wrong." She didn't wait for a response, she just crawled in. The space inside the collapse was approximately 1 meter of clearance between the floor and the lowest beam. She worked by the light of a mana lamp she'd strapped to her forearm. The blood was coming from 3 separate sites. She identified them by following the flow patterns, which was faster than trying to find the wounds directly in the limited visibility. Vaelor was unconscious. His resonance field was doing what resonance fields do when the body is in critical distress, which is collapse inward, a kind of biological retreat that conserves energy at the cost of the external pathways. When the external pathways go, internal hemorrhage accelerates. She had, at a generous estimate, 15 minutes before the internal pressure reached an unsurvivable threshold. Medically, standard protocol for resonance field collapse was stabilization first, shore up the external pathways, by time, wait for surgical support. She did not have 15 minutes for stabilization first. She looked at the collapsed resonance field and made a decision that she had never seen documented anywhere and that she would later write up in a 30-page methodology paper that the guild would initially refuse to publish. She cut directly into the damaged pathways, not around them, not beneath them, not with the careful peripheral approach the guild's trauma manual prescribed, through them, using the collapse itself as a map, because a collapsing resonance field leaves a readable signature of where the damage originated, and if you can read the signature you can find the hemorrhage source directly. It worked because she'd spent her childhood watching her mother work on river folk who couldn't afford the time that guild protocol required. River medicine is fast medicine. She had learned fast before she learned correct, and tonight fast and correct happened to be the same direction. 20 minutes. Eventually Vaelor gasped. The tunnel erupted into noise. Rescue workers cheering. Lyra had no idea it had been that quiet. The two guild healers talking rapidly into their communication devices, the structural engineer who'd been holding the ceiling beam steady with a pneumatic jack saying something that was probably not appropriate for a professional setting but was understandable given the circumstances. Lyra sat back on her heels and let herself breathe for the first time in 20 minutes. Then a guild official arrived. He examined the report. He examined the patients. He examined Lyra with a particular look that said he was calculating how many protocol violations he was looking at and whether the patient's survival was going to make that calculation complicated. You violated 4 protocols. Straight to the point. The 2 other healers wouldn't meet her eyes. Lyra was somewhat prepared for this. Only 4. The guild worm smiled in the way only a worm can smile. You are suspended pending review. Vaelor opened one eye. The guild official went very still. Vaelor's voice was terrible, hoarse, slow, each word separated by the effort of someone working through significant pain, but the words themselves were perfectly clear. She's promoted, he croaked. What? The official stuttered. Promoted, Vaelor repeated. Grand Surgeon Dutton, the wormy man tried again. You are currently in a state of severe medical. Promoted. Vaelor's tone carried the decisiveness of finality. The official looked between them for a long moment. Then he left, probably to find a form that covered this specific situation or some rule that could get in the way of it, which Lyra suspected did not exist. 3 weeks later she started working directly under Vaelor Dutton. She immediately and consistently regretted it and kept showing up anyway because the work was the most interesting work she'd ever done, and she had long ago accepted that interesting and comfortable were different categories. Vaelor was impossible in the specific way that people who had been raised to believe they are prodigies are impossible, which is that his standards were not arbitrary. He could explain exactly why he held them and his explanations were usually correct, and being correctly impossible is significantly worse than being incorrectly impossible because you can't dismiss it. He arrived before sunrise. He left after midnight on the nights when nothing urgent happened and stayed until the urgent thing was done on the nights when it did. He handed back her notes with one word, wrong, and when she pushed back he explained specifically what was wrong with a precision that she found infuriating because it meant she had to fix it rather than argue about it. 1 week in, he handed back her case notes. No, that one word. She pushed back. The diagnosis is correct. How you got there is lucky, he said sounding tired. She stayed infuriated. The patient recovered. Vaelor smiled like a reptile. Exactly, because they got lucky. She looked at him across the desk. She started walking out of the office, then stopped. You ask, do you always do this? No, he didn't even look up. I get worse during emergencies. What she learned over the following months, he was right about the lucky diagnosis, not because she had made an error but because she had reached the right conclusion via a process that would not have worked in 15% of similar presentations, which meant it was a good guess dressed as a good method, and the difference mattered. She tightened the method, the luck percentage dropped, he noticed without mentioning it, which was somehow more effective than if he had. What she did not expect were the days when he was wrong. They arrived, not often, usually in the space between his methodology and a patient who didn't fit the documented population. His training was excellent and his population was Veskari dominant, guild medicine was Veskari dominant, and the river folk of the Soak presented differently. Different baseline resonance levels, different ether tolerance thresholds, different stress responses shaped by different lives. She noticed it first on a Neri patient from the southern wards with a resonance condition that Vaelor was treating by the book and not improving. She pointed it out, the baseline is wrong. He didn't even look up from his chart when he said, the baseline is standard. It's standard for a Veskari presentation, this is Neri. He paused at that. The guild's documentation covers all populations, he said. Lyra sensed this was a sensitive topic. Sir, the guild's documentation was written by people who treated the populations they had access to. In these buildings, those populations skew Veskari. Another pause, longer. Show me the differential, he said, his face now holding more interest. She showed him. The numbers were not ambiguous. He adjusted the treatment. The patient improved inside 48 hours. He did not apologize, but the next week he asked her to review all their active Neri and other amphibian heritage cases for baseline discrepancies, which was Vaelor's version of an apology. She catalogued this and filed it away. Then the Tideworm hunter arrived. His name was Kale Dorn, and he came through the guild ward doors at 4 in the morning carrying enough Tideworm venom in his system to drop a Leviathan, which he announced immediately and with the calm of a man reporting a mildly inconvenient weather event. He was broad, salt-weathered, missing the top joint of his left index finger from an encounter he mentioned later with the same casual tone he used for everything, a bracken serpent in the southern marshes, nothing serious. He'd been 20 and overconfident. He had the physicality of someone who had spent their entire adult life in environments that were actively trying to kill him and had developed a comprehensive professional understanding of exactly how to avoid that happening. The guild night staff who received him had no documented treatment for tideworm envenomation because tideworm hunters were not a large population, and the existing notes were field reports rather than clinical data, and mostly they said don't get bitten, which was not medically useful. Lyra was pulled in at 4:15 because Vaelor had left a standing instruction that unusual presentations came to her first. She stood at Cale Dorn's bedside and looked at his chart as she asked how it happened. He looked at her for a moment. Then he started talking. What Cale Dorn knew about tideworm venom was not what the guild's brief field notes knew, which was essentially, dangerous, avoid. What he knew was accumulated through 12 years of hunting them, 3 personal exposures at varying doses, observation of 17 colleagues variously envenomated and either recovered or not, and a naturalist's curiosity about the creatures themselves that had nothing to do with his professional requirements and everything to do with the fact that he found them genuinely fascinating. He talked for 2 hours, Lyra took notes for 2 hours. Vaelor arrived at 6, read the notes, sat down at Cale's side, and asked him now he got bitten again. Didn't your colleague cover this? Cale said. Please, Mr. Dorn, Vaelor responded with uncharacteristic patience, start over. Cale started over. What emerged from 12 hours of treatment and questioning was a picture of tideworm venom that the guild had never assembled because no one had thought to ask the hunters, which was the guild being structurally incurious about knowledge that came from outside its documented channels. The venom was a resonance disruptor. It didn't poison tissue in the conventional sense. It interfered with the resonance pathways that tissue used to communicate with the body's central core, a distributed signal interruption rather than a chemical toxin. This mattered because it meant the treatment vector was resonance stabilization rather than toxin neutralization. Lyra had started on that approach at 4:15 by instinct and by Cale's description of what had and hadn't worked in previous field exposures. She'd been right. Vaelor had arrived at the same conclusion independently via the chart data by 6:30. They'd looked at each other across the patient without saying anything and then proceeded on the same approach. Cale noticed, you two are strange. He said from the bed, watching them work. You should be focused on your breathing to stabilize your pathways, Mr. Dorn. Lyra said with a smile. I'm breathing fine, Cale waved at her. You two work like you're angry at each other but reading the same book. The breathing, Mr. Dorn, Vaelor maintained. Cale breathed, but he was smiling. He recovered fully in 4 days. He came back 6 weeks later with a data journal he'd been keeping on tideworm physiology for 3 years that he decided, after watching them work, was probably more useful in their hands than in his pack. He dropped it on Lyra's desk and said, if you write this up, put my name on it. Lyra skimmed through the notes. There were some invaluable information there. Why, Mr. Dorn, you're not losing confidence in our ability to treat your field mishaps, are you? She asked the field observer. Bah, I'm just feeling scholarly since watching you two work, Cale sneered, good-naturedly. And next time someone in your ward has a bracken serpent exposure, call me before you treat them, I've got notes. She looked from the journal in her hand to Vaelor in the doorway. Is this a riverfolk thing? He asked Lyra. Why are you happy about this? Cale is choosing to become a resource. She explained, the Neri are beginning to trust this place enough to contribute to it. It's progress in a great direction. Vaelor looked unconvinced, but he read the journal that night. She knew because it was on his desk the next morning with annotations. That was the beginning of what the guild, much later and with the reluctance of institutions acknowledging things they didn't originate, would call the Dorn Feris methodology, the practice of going to the people who lived with the creatures rather than the people who had documented them from a safe distance. It was obvious in retrospect. Most correct ideas are. It changed how they worked, both of them. Vaelor's precision applied to Lyra's intuitive fieldwork created something better than either alone. He could standardize and formalize what she developed. She could find what his standardization was missing. The arguments didn't stop. The work got more intriguing. One night they spent 12 hours rebuilding a shattered resonance lattice array inside a dying harbor engineer named Aldous who had been standing too close to a conduit relay when it cascaded. The surgery ended near dawn. Vaelor collapsed into a chair. Lyra dropped into another. Aldous breathed steadily on the table between them. When Lyra finally broke the silence that hung in the air, she said, You owe me 20 crowns. How's that? Vaelor asked. You said survival was statistically unlikely. That is because survival was statistically unlikely, Ms. Feris. I fail to see your point. Lyra points to Aldous breathing steadily on the table. He survived. You owe me 20 crowns. He looked at Aldous, then at her, then something happened in his expression that she hadn't seen before, a kind of surprised amusement. He laughed. It was a real laugh, short, genuine, a little tired. Lyra tried not to dwell too much on it because she was exhausted and the moment felt fragile, and she was a better scientist than to draw conclusions from a single data point. But she filed it. The year that followed was the kind of year that looks unremarkable from outside and is the most important one from inside. Surgeries, research, emergencies, the city's resonance lattice reactor meltdown in the harbor district. They worked 36 hours without stopping, Vaelor running the containment protocol while Lyra treated the exposure casualties, and somewhere in hour 20 they'd stopped narrating their decisions to each other and started anticipating them, which was when she understood that they had stopped being two practitioners working together and started being one diagnostic process, distributed across two people. The swamp fever outbreak in the southern wards. Kale appeared on day 3 with field notes on how the southern marsh communities had managed it before guild medicine reached the area, which the guild's registered practitioners found offensive, and which turned out to contain the key to the treatment approach. She noticed Vaelor absorbing the information without commenting on its source, which was growth. The evening started happening, not planned. They'd finish a shift and keep talking because the conversation wasn't done, and the talking would migrate from the ward to the maintenance bridge over the harbor where the steam from the engine vents made the air warm even in autumn and the leviathans were visible on clear nights, great glass shapes drifting through the upper clouds like something the sky was dreaming. One evening he said, "You never talk about your family." Lyra was surprised by it. "You never asked." "Mr. Dutton." "Ms. Feris, consider this an instance of me asking." She looked across the water. "Might as well get it all out at once. My mother was a river healer, not guild, the kind that works traditional medicine and resonance-adjacent medicine for people who can't afford guild rates." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You taught yourself resonance lattice theory while working there?" She shrugged. "Indeed, that's where I learned to work." Another pause. Quietly, he said, "My father expected me in the guild directorate by 30, grand surgeon is a disappointment to him." She looked at this. "That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. My family is Veskari to its core. Veskari families have a complicated relationship with achievement. The bar keeps moving." She sighed. "That sounds exhausting." Vaelor shook his head. "It is." They stood there. The harbor lights were reflected in broken patterns on the water. She understood, in the way she was beginning to understand him, that he had just told her something he didn't tell people generally. She didn't make a thing of it. That was also growth, though on her end. On a later evening, a different bridge, the sky doing something important with clouds and light. He broke the silence. "I used to think I'd leave this city." He looked at her, "And now I'm not sure." The silence lasted longer than their silences usually did. "Do you regret saving me?" he asked her. She looked at him. "No," she said. "Even knowing what came after, the paperwork alone. I do hate paperwork." She held his gaze. He stepped closer. She didn't step back. There was a moment where they were both aware of the moment, which is the specific condition that precedes the decision. The first time he kissed her it was on that bridge with the harbor lights behind him and her hands were still cold from the night air and she thought, single data point, but she was smiling. The relationship was secret because officially, the guild prohibited relationships between practitioners of different rank. In actuality they prohibited relationships between people of different social classes. Their specific case seemed to be doomed both formally and informally. Naturally the secrecy made it more complicated. Naturally that was also true of most things involving the guild. For months in, Vaelor gave her a lattice-drawn ring, not a formal gesture, a small bronze thing set with a piece of resonance crystal that he'd attuned specifically to her personal field frequency, so it would warm when she was under sustained magical stress as a signal to stop and breathe, a practical gift, and Vaelor Dutton gift. She wore it on her right hand where it looked like a practitioner's tool and nobody asked about it. She first noticed something wrong in one of the Southern Marshes reports, in the data, in the numbers that didn't fit, in the shape of a symptom cluster that should have been one thing and was another. 3 villages, collective population approximately 4,000, presenting with memory lapses concentrated around specific 3-day windows, resonance field instability that didn't correspond to any environmental mana disruptions or dietary cause, and this was the one that made her read the report 3 times, shared dream content, not similar dreams, identical ones, down to specific spatial details, specific language, specific sequential events, reported independently by people in different villages who had no documented contact with each other. She carried the files to Vaelor's office at 7 in the morning, which wasn't particularly early even by their standards. He looked up, saw her face and remarked, "Emergency?" She frowned deeper. "Maybe." He put his work away. "Define maybe." She dropped the files on his desk. "Folk from 3 separate villages haven't been seen for 3 whole days." He pulled the files closer to look them over. He said, "What?" She sat across from him. 3 days, gone, collectively. The absence is consistent across the population of each village. nothing else seems to be missing but the people themselves. He read through the first file, picked up the second, read it. By the third file his expression had done what she'd learned to read as the confidence retreating, not doubt, exactly, more like the moment when a practitioner encounters a presentation outside their established framework and has to decide whether the presentation is wrong. Do you think this might be a relatively new resonance phenomenon? I suspect it might be a new flare. There is no documented resonance phenomenon like this, she agreed. Interesting, we might need to call in our friend Kale for a consult, he said. Kale Dorn read the reports without expression. He'd come in to drop off an updated set of field notes on an aggressive mutant sea creature they'd been tracking and had stayed to check in with Lyra. He read the 3 reports twice. Then he said, I'd heard there had been rumor of similar dreams happening to the people around there, with recurring shared elements. Lyra checked her notes: water, talking machinery, darkness, a sense of something coming closer before they wake up. Kale was quiet. Lyra studied him. You know something? Kale smiling in his cocky way. I know a lot of things, Ms. Feris. Most of them I decide not to share because they make people uncomfortable and I am told they rarely help. Vaelor stepped up. This one might help, Mr. Dorn, he said. Kale looked between them, then he said, in the hunting community there are stories about the deep resonance. A different kind of magic, not the resonance we use in engines, something older, something the creatures respond to in a more visceral way. The tideworms are more sensitive to it. Some say leviathans navigate by it. There are old hunter accounts of people who spent too long in proximity to certain places where they are found, or creatures, the very large ones, the ancient ones, developing symptoms like these, hearing things, sharing awareness with other people who have had similar exposure. Lyra asked, what kind of exposure? Kale waved his hands abstractly. It's been random so far, too much exposure to raw mana, being present when one of the large creatures is dying, he paused, or waking up. The room was quiet. What exactly is the deep resonance? Vaelor asked. Kale said, I don't know, I don't think anyone does, but the creatures know, they've always known. He picked up his jacket. If you start getting reports of creature behavioral changes alongside these missing civilians events, I want to know immediately. He left. Lyra looked at Vaelor. He knows more than he's saying, Vaelor said, as they watched the retreating from of Kale. He knows more than he knows how to say, Lyra said, that's different. The ancient resonance engines activated first. This was the detail that validated the words Kale had dropped off. 7 engines in 7 separate locations across the Ethries coast, engines that had been dormant for a documented minimum of 800 years, that appeared in historical records as non-functional ruins, activated simultaneously on a Tuesday morning in early autumn without any external input that anyone could identify. They didn't do anything, exactly, they hummed. The frequency was outside the standard resonance range the guild's instruments monitored, which meant for 3 days nobody noticed except Kale, who noticed because his tideworm tracking equipment operated in adjacent frequency ranges. He sent Lyra a note. The note said, your weird problem is getting weirder, come look at this. She made plans to do just that. Then the lantern stag appeared inside Tidewall. She was in the outer ward reviewing discharge paperwork when someone ran past the window, then several people ran past the window, then the paperwork stopped mattering and she went to the window and watched a creature the size of a huge draft horse walk calmly through the financial district, its antlers throwing light in shifting geometric patterns across the building facades, its hooves clicking on the cobblestones with a rhythm that didn't quite match its gait, as though it was walking to a beat the rest of the world couldn't hear. It walked through a stone wall, not through a gap in the wall, through the wall itself. The stone didn't break, the stag simply passed through it the way water passes through cloth. Then it was gone. A guild researcher who'd been watching from the street stood there for a long moment and then muttered reverently, lantern stags don't enter cities. A second researcher rounded on the first, well, they do now. Nobody laughed. Lyra was already compartmentalizing the incident report in her head, when she noticed something that nobody else seemed to have caught. The path the lantern stag had taken through the city was not random. It had walked in a direct line from the western harbor to the site of the original conduit rupture, straight through 3 city blocks, a path that corresponded exactly to the underground route of the resonance conduit. She went back to her office and laid the stag's path over a city infrastructure map. Then she laid the locations of the activated ancient engines over the same map. They connected, not obviously, you had to extend the lines, find the intersections, but they connected, a pattern that the city's existing infrastructure had been built on top of without anyone understanding what the pattern was. She brought it to Vaelor. He looked at the map for a long time. In a whisper he said, this has been here the whole time. Lyra nodded. Yes, under the city. She tapped the map, under everything. When Lady Seraphine arrived, Lyra immediately disliked her, which she later understood was not the correct response for the correct reasons but was very human, and she has made peace with that. Seraphine Alteri was the daughter of a first-house noble family, which in Vescari terms meant old enough to have architecture named after them, and she arrived in Tidewall with a guild directorate escort and a research mandate for the southern marsh anomalies that nobody had asked Lyra's opinion on. She was brilliant, this was immediately and irritatingly clear. She understood resonance theory at a depth that matched Vaelor's, which was a very small group. She was also kind, which Lyra found perplexing and uncomfortable, because it was easier to dismiss people who were unkind. At their first meeting, Seraphine smiled and extended a long, graceful hand to her. "Dr. Feris," she said, "I've heard wonderful things about you." Lyra liked and hated that she used the right honorific. Not a lot of that happen around these testosterone-laden walls. "I am afraid I haven't enjoyed the same pleasure." Vaelor made a sound that was not quite a cough. Seraphine's smile didn't waver. She filed it all somewhere behind her eyes and moved on. She was good at that. What Lyra didn't know then was, Seraphine had arrived in Tidewall with memories of a relationship with Vaelor that she believed was real and that she had no reason to question, not because she was foolish, because Vescari child betrothals don't announce themselves as constructed, they simply are. She remembered correspondence, dinners, a decision between elder Vescari family heads on a particular balcony where something had been all but set in stone. She remembered the guild directorate endorsing the arrangement between their families. She had come, in part, because she believed she was coming home to someone. What she found instead was a hospital that barely acknowledged her presence and a partner who was formally courteous and professionally engaged and emotionally absent in a way that she was trying very hard not to interpret as what it looked like. Lyra didn't see any of this. She was not looking for it. She was watching the political machinery close around the research work she and Vaelor had built and feeling it happen and not knowing how to stop it. The worst was yet to come. Joint appearances, joint project credits, joint announcements where Seraphine's name appeared beside Vaelor's on work that Lyra had contributed substantially to. The guild loved every second of it. The guild's interests in a Dutton-Alteri alliance were transparent and significant and had nothing to do with medicine. Lyra told herself her irritation was professional. It very personal and she knew it, but professional was a more comfortable place to stand. The night before a grand ascension ceremony, she and Vaelor argued about a Neri patient whose treatment she thought they were managing wrong. The argument was real and legitimate and ended correctly with him agreeing to adjust the approach. But there was something underneath it that neither of them addressed, which was, she had been in the same building as him for 4 months carrying a ring tuned to her resonance frequency, and he had been in the same building not telling her something. She went home, she slept badly, she wore her best coat to the ceremony because she had expected it to be a good day. She walked in and immediately understood that something was wrong. The specific wrongness was in Vaelor's posture. She knew his posture the way a practitioner learns a body they've worked alongside for a year, and his posture said, trapped. She thought, I should leave. She stayed. She had spent her whole life staying when she should have been more careful about the difference between staying and enduring. The guildmaster said the words. Seraphine stepped onto the stage. Vaelor stood there with his hands at his sides and his jaw set. The applause was very loud. Lyra stopped hearing it. When their eyes met across the hall, his expression was the most honest she had seen it. It said, I'm sorry. None of those things were enough. She knew that and she thought he knew that too. She left before the ceremony ended. She walked to the harbor and stood there in the rain because she needed to be somewhere the noise couldn't reach her. Vaelor found her. She continued watching the water. He spoke more cautiously than she'd ever heard him. Lyra, we need to talk. No, we don't, she said, it has already happened. He reached for her hand. It is not that simple. She laughed. It came out wrong, too short, too sharp, not remotely funny. It is exactly that simple. You made your decision. You made it in that room in front of everyone. He stepped forward, explaining anyway. He started with the guild, the family, the political machinery, the weight of the arrangement, all the things that were real and true and completely beside the point. Lyra listened, let him vent himself. When he was done, she said, I know all of those things exist. I'm not pretending they don't, I'm saying you had a choice, and I watched you make it. She took the resonance ring of the finger of her right hand. It was warm from her mana. It was always warm, it had been tuned to her, and she was actively aware of this as she held it out to him. She was a scientist and it was her job to notice precision. His face changed. Yes, she'd wanted that. She's not proud of wanting it, she wanted it anyway. She pressed the ring into his hand and walked away. He didn't follow. She did not want him to. The next morning she resigned. The guild accepted before lunch with a speed that said they'd been waiting. By evening the rumors had already done the work that rumors do, not lies, exactly, but truths arranged to serve a narrative. She was difficult, she was uncollegiate, she had disagreed with methodology, she had left. Her research credits disappeared, her procedure innovations were absorbed into guild documentation without attribution. Even the note she'd pinned to the ward office corkboard reminding staff to verify the baseline differentials for Neri patients, even that was gone. replaced by someone else's perfectly ordinary notes. Tidewall moved on, as a place does when the unwanted finally stayed in their place. She bought a train ticket south. The train left at dawn and she watched the city disappear behind steam clouds and told herself she was fine with the certainty of someone who is extremely not fine. A curious child across the aisle asked, "Are you crying?" She looked out the window. "No." The child said, "My mother cries like that." Lyra thought, "Your mother must be in a very hard and unhappy place." The nosy child was not wrong. She was also 7 years old and therefore not someone Lyra was going to argue with or inform about hard and unhappy places. The sky chose that moment to change. The shadow came first, enormous, moving against the wind, the wrong kind of shadow for clouds. Passengers rushed to the windows. The child pressed her nose against the glass. Then someone in the carriage ahead screamed and Lyra saw it and for a moment just looked at it because the mind requires a moment with something unprecedented. 3,000 feet of glass leviathan, falling. The creature just let go, not tumbling, not chaotic. The wings were still moving, the resonance lattice within it was still active. She could see that much from the train window, the faint blue shimmer that was a living leviathan's mana field, pulsing wrong, the rhythm fractured. It hit the sea offshore and the impact shook the coast like a struck bell. Lyra was off the train before it finished trembling, running straight into the chaos because she was exactly the same person she'd been and leaving had apparently not changed that. Kale was already there. She hadn't known he was on the coast. She found out later he'd been tracking a tideworm pod in the offshore shelf and had been on a hired boat when the leviathan fell. He'd reached the beach 20 minutes before she did and was crouched at the creature's nearest visible surface with his instruments and the focused stillness of a man who has spent his career around the unusual. He looked up when she appeared. "Took you long enough," he said. "I was occupied," she responded. "I just got off the train." "Right," he looked back at the creature. "It's alive, barely." She crouched beside him. She placed her hand against the surface. Leviathan anatomy is glass smooth, cold, the resonance field perceptible as vibration rather than warmth, and immediately felt what he'd meant. The field was fractured, not disrupted the way a tideworm's venom disrupted a field, not collapsed the way a resonance injury field collapsed, fractured along structural lines, like something had put pressure on it from inside, and the structure had given way. "This is internal," she said, "something inside the field is breaking it." "What does that in a leviathan?" Kale was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The last time I read about something that presented like this in a leviathan was in a 300-year-old hunter's record that I found in a marsh trader's collection. One account, the hunter said the creature had been in proximity to something old, something in the deep that was moving." Lyra kept her hand on the leviathan's surface. The field pulsed against her palm, irregular, searching, the way a patient's pulse searches when the body is running out of options. Then somehow, it called. Not in sound, within the resonance, a pulse that ran up her arm and into her chest and behind her eyes and opened something she didn't have language for. She was in the ocean, dark, cold, vast, and there were shapes in the dark, enormous shapes, the scale of islands, the scale of geological time, and one of them had an eye and the eye was open and it was looking at exactly the place where she was standing. She came back screaming. Kale caught her. When she came to, she was on the beach. Her hand had left the creature's surface, her vision was clearing, the leviathan's field had gone still. It had died while she was inside it. The beach was very quiet. Kale had his hands on her shoulders and was watching her with an almost reverent expression, not panicked, not pitying, attending. "What did you see?" he asked gently. She told him everything, every detail she could still access, because it was already fading the way dreams fade and she knew she had to get it out while the bones of it still held. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, 7 shapes and 1 eye open, only one?" "Yes," she confirmed. He was quiet for a long moment. Around them other researchers were arriving, scholars and guild representatives and curious civilians, and none of it seemed real against the weight of what she'd just been inside. Kale spoke with a heaviness. In the old hunter accounts, the deep resonance was described as the breathing of something below the world, not a creature, something the creatures were part of. He paused. The accounts that described it as waking always described it as incomplete, one part of it opening before the others. "What does that mean?" Lyra asked. "I don't know exactly," Kale admitted, "but 1 eye open out of 7 does not seem like a good sign." Then the old man appeared. She hadn't seen him approach. He was simply there, old enough to be timeless, dressed in the practical layers of someone who traveled constantly, watching her with the expression of someone who had been expecting to find her here and was not surprised that he had. "You, my dear, have heard the heart of the world." Lyra was stunned by that. "Heard what?" He said, "The deep resonance." She was honest, "I don't know what that is." He seemed to be expecting that. "That's very good." He held out a brass coin, small, worn smooth, a hollow circle crossed by a flowing current line. She took it, as she said, "What is this?" A warning. His smile faded. "The wrong parts of the world are waking up." He turned to leave. She stepped after him. He paused, looked back. "You have the coin, that means you have the question. Follow the question or the money, whichever one comes first." He was gone into the crowd before she could form the next sentence. Kale, at her shoulder, asked, "Who was that?" She sighed, "I don't know." He looked at her, "Do you trust them?" She shook her head, "Not at all." He nodded, "Good, me neither, at least, that's one thing we both know definitively out of all this." He picked up his instrument case, "But we should probably follow the question and the money anyway." 3 weeks later she was in the flooded marshlands of southern Ethries with Kale beside her, a brass coin in her pocket and a map she'd drawn in her sleep. The sleep drawing had started on the 4th night after the beach. She'd wake to find lines on whatever paper was near the bed, not random lines, not artistic ones, the precise intentional lines of a destination taking form, coordinates, routes. She'd recognized the handwriting as hers immediately, which was more disturbing than if it hadn't been. Kale had found her at breakfast on the 3rd morning staring at a coastal chart she'd filled in overnight. Kale didn't hold back. "You look terrible." Lyra laughed. "Thank you." He said, "How long since you slept?" "I sleep, that's the problem." He looked at the chart, then he said, "All right, where are we going?" She showed him the coordinates. He looked at them for a long time, then he said, "I know what's there, or what was there. I went through that area twice on marsh transit routes, both times I looked directly at it and filed it away as nothing notable." He paused. "I've been trying to work out why." She grasped the coin in her pocket tightly. "Maybe you did not have the right key or coin." He said with a wink, "I guess my own old man stranger forgot to give me my toll." The ruins were exactly where the map said they'd be, visible at sunset, half-submerged, ancient. The steam vents between the broken stone pathways were active, naturally occurring, she thought at first, until she looked more carefully and realized they were too regular, too directed, occurring at intervals that suggested infrastructure rather than geology. Maintained, she thought, but by what? The footprints in the soft ground near the eastern approach were fresh, large group. She and Kale exchanged wary looks. She asked, "Do we follow them?" "Obviously," he said. He unslung the harpoon from his back, checked the charge, and kept it loose in his hand. "For the record, I'd like to note that everything about this is bad practice." Lyra rolled her eyes, noted. "Great." Kale said, "Let's go." The underground chamber was enormous and impossible and fully operational, which were 3 things that should not have coexisted in an ancient ruin that had been forgotten long enough to develop that much moss on its exterior. The woman who emerged from behind one of the resonance pillars was named Surana Pelager. She had the silver scale pattern of deep-water heritage along her neck and forearms, rare enough that Lyra had only seen it twice before, and the bearing of someone who had been waiting for an unspecified time and was privately irritated at how long it was taking. Pelager wasn't feeling hospitable. "You're late, and you're dragging your feet." Lyra stuttered, You expected me?" The woman sniffed, "Unfortunately." Lyra immediately disliked her. Sadly, she didn't save her thought from reaching her face. The woman noticed. "Good," she said, "you have common sense." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "People who trust strangers on first meeting tend to die before the lessons kick in," the woman said. Kale, at Lyra's shoulder, said, "I like her." The woman looked at him. She said, "Kale Dorn." Kale put on his most charming smile, "Serena." Lyra looked between them. Kale shrugged shyly. "We've crossed paths in the southern marshes a few times, she's not a problem." Serena looked at Lyra. "I'm the one who's been tracking the anomalies in this region for the past 6 months, before either of you arrived." She paused, before anyone thought to look. She pointed toward the center of the chamber. The people from the missing village were there. All of them, 4,000 residents, Lyra counted later, verified against the population records, preserved, housed, sleeping, not in their beds, standing, sitting, lying on floors, in positions of sudden suspension as though someone had reached into the middle of an ordinary day and stopped it, a woman frozen mid-gesture in conversation, a child stopped mid-run with one foot raised, an old man asleep in a chair he'd clearly been asleep in before anything changed, undisturbed, just paused. Lyra moved immediately. Serena caught her arm. Lyra yelled, "What are you doing? Let me go." Serena held on. "Silly girl, we already tried." Several other figures emerged from the edges of the chamber, researchers, engineers, a Delver-class practitioner still in field gear, exhausted faces, people who had been here long enough to stop being surprised and start being worried. She let herself be talked through the testing record, everything standard, nothing explanatory. She stood at the edge of the sleeping population and looked at them and tried to read the presentation the way she read any unusual presentation, without assumption, starting with what was observable. They were breathing, slowly, but breathing, resonance fields intact. She checked 3 at random, borrowed Kale's field reader. The fields were not collapsed or disrupted, they were oriented, pointing in the same direction, all of them, 4,000 resonance fields aligned like compass needles toward magnetic north, except the direction they pointed toward wasn't north, it was down. She said, their fields are oriented toward the source, toward the deep resonance. They're not asleep, they're attending something or someone. A silence. Then one of the sleeping villagers sat upright. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, a farmer by the look of his hands. His eyes were open and entirely wrong. The iris had expanded to fill most of the visible surface, dark and deep. He started speaking, rapidly, urgently, in a language that was not any language currently in use. Kale went still. Surana glanced at him. What is it, do you understand the language? That's not any living language. He said, I've heard fragments of it in old hunter texts, the oldest ones, pre-settlement. Then the deep resonance rumbled inside her chest, the same resonance that had come through the Leviathan, through her hand, through the vision on the beach. The coin in her pocket was warm. The words became understandable. Not perfectly, just enough. She swayed and swallowed. Kale caught her before she fell. What did he say? Everyone looked at her. Lyra steadied herself. He said the gods are dying. No one laughed, not because they believed in the gods, because they had all been in this chamber long enough to stop trusting the things they'd been sure of. The chamber shook. The floor, the walls, the ceiling, the whole ancient structure trembled, steam lines burst. Machinery that had been humming steadily began screaming, and from somewhere below, something answered. A resonance pulse exploded outward. Every sleeping villager sat upright simultaneously. 4,000 faces turned toward the ceiling. 4,000 mouths opened. In one voice. It said, he returns. Then they all collapsed, the pulse vanished, the silence that replaced it felt physical. Serena handed Lyra a journal, ancient, water-damaged, falling apart, the first page embossed with the same symbol as the brass coin. Lyra took the book. Just like the old man at the beach, she muttered. You met one, Serena said. Lyra was confused. One what? Surana pointed at the sign on the book, the hollow current. One of the researchers made a superstitious sign over himself, another edged toward the exit. Lyra had to know, what is a hollow current? Serena's answer sounded careful and ultimately revealed that she knew significantly more about this than she'd indicated. She explained, the Hollow Current is an organization old enough to predate the Guild, old enough to predate most of Tidewall's history, not a secret society exactly, more a maintenance crew, people who had understood something about the world's actual workings and spent a very long time making sure no one else had to deal with the consequences of that working structure failing. She turned to Lyra, did they recruit you? Lyra other hand grabbed the coin in her pocket, he gave me a coin. Serena's expression shifted, she said, voluntarily? Several researchers exchanged looks. Serena looked at Kale. Kale said, yes, is that unusual? Serena said, they don't recruit, they observe, they interfere when they have to. She looked at the coin in Lyra's hand. They've never given anyone a coin voluntarily, not in any record I've found. Kale's voice carried some seriousness. So what does all of this mean? Serena opened rather tome looking for the last legible entry. It read, if the seventh god wakes, the world ends. Lyra stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she laughed, once, short, the laugh that comes when the alternative is something she didn't want to contemplate. She hated the sound of all that, of course. She breathed, why wouldn't it be a sleeping god? She needed to get back to Tidewall. She knew this the moment the chamber settled, not because Tidewall had the answers, she was fairly sure now that the answers were nowhere comfortable, but because the data was there, her research, Vaelor's research, the anomaly reports they'd been accumulating before she resigned. She needed that data and she needed it whole, not piecemeal. And she needed Vaelor, they would work faster together. She was honest with herself about this in the way she was honest about most clinical matters, which was directly and without excessive comfort. She needed him because he had half of what she needed and because he was the best diagnostic mind she'd worked alongside and because the problem in front of her was not a problem you solved alone. She was also honest about the fact that needing something professionally and being ready for it personally were two different things, and she was currently not ready for either. Kale read her silence correctly. He said, Tidewall. Lyra nodded. He said, I'll come. Serena said, so will I. Neither argued. Lyra looked at Serena across the chamber, at the large tome in her hands, at the exhausted researchers who'd been here for months without anyone noticing. She said, "How long have you been tracking this?" Serena said, "Long enough to know I can't finish it alone." Lyra had to ask, "What are you?" Serena Pelliger didn't seem fazed by the query. "A historian, a delver, someone who finds things people lost on purpose." She paused, "And right now, someone who is going to Tidewall." She said it the way people say things they've already decided. They arrived in Tidewall to find it changed in a way she couldn't immediately name. The city looked the same, the steam engines ran, the harbor was full. But something was off in the ambient resonance, a flatness, a quality of the air that she'd learned to read as she'd learned to read a patient's ambient field, and what it said was, something is being suppressed here. She figured out how wrong it was when she asked a dockworker for directions to the archive district, and he looked at her with mild confusion. "The archive district," she repeated, "the research buildings along the eastern harbor." "No," he said, "that's not on the eastern harbor, the harbor fronts north, miss." Lyra stopped, "The harbor fronts east. It always has." He smiled patiently as he said, "You must be thinking of somewhere else. Tidewall is an inland city." Kale caught her arm before she could respond. She turned, he shook his head slightly. They walked on. The Grand Archive contained 2,000 years of maritime records. She walked in and the shelves were full of desert cartography. She stood in the entry hall and breathed. She looked at the desert maps. She looked at the librarians moving between shelves with complete normalcy. Then someone grabbed her wrist. She turned and he was there. Vaelor. They hadn't been in the same room in 3 months. The gap between that and this one felt like a physical thing she could measure. She ran a rapid involuntary assessment the way she did with every person she encountered, his posture, his field, the visible indicators, and what she read was, 3 months of not sleeping properly, significant stress, and behind his eyes, well, he hadn't been sleeping well. "Good," said a part of her. "Stop that," said a more sensible part. She pulled away. "What are you doing here?" I live here," he said. "I've been trying to reach you for." Then the window behind him shattered. The dreamers arrived without warning, which in retrospect was predictable. They were already within the city's resonance field before anyone's instruments registered them. 4,000 people with silver dark eyes, organized, calm, purposeful, walking in the same direction. Lyra ran outside. The streets were a chaos of people who don't understand what they're afraid of, which is the worst kind of chaos to navigate because it has no logic to it. Guild guards were mobilizing, steamwalkers clanking through the main thoroughfares, clockwork artillery rolling into position. And the dreamers advancing slowly, directly toward the city center, not reacting to any of it. She reached Serena and Kale on the outer steps of the archive. "They're the villagers." "Yes." Serena confirmed, "All of them." Kale said, "And more. Others have been added since the chamber." He was watching the dreamers' movement with tactical attention. He added, "They're not heading for the archive." Lyra followed his sight line. He was right. The dreamers' vector wasn't the archive or the guild hall or any of the obvious institutional targets. It was the city center, specifically the central resonance conduit junction, the infrastructure node where all of Tidewall's primary resonance lines converged. Serena said, "They're going to the source." Then the bell appeared. It emerged from the clouds above the city center in that impossible way when reality warps inexplicably, slowly, and then all at once. Enormous. Ancient. Floating without visible support. Covered in resonance sigils that Lyra recognized, not the guild's notation system, something older, the same script as the journal, the same forms as the brass coin. The deep resonance spoke. Not inside her head this time. Outside. Everywhere. The second lock has broken. The bell rang. And the city became several things at once. Every memory in Tidewall shifted simultaneously. The sea that the city had forgotten flickered back into existence and then out again. The city was a harbor and a desert and a forest and a mountain city and a river town, all of them overlapping, all of them real and none of them real, the resonance of 400 years of accumulated civic identity destabilizing at its foundation. Lyra went down hard. Blood from her nose. The pressure change when reality flickered was something the body experienced physically too. Then Vaelor was beside her saying, "Stay conscious." She whispered, still giving orders, "I see." Still ignoring good advice, he countered. Serena landed beside them and said, "Less arguing. More surviving." Both of them looked at her. Serena said, "That wasn't flirting between you two just now, was it?" Then the sky cracked. A fracture opened across the visible atmosphere, a dark line widening, and behind it not space, not atmosphere, but something structural, machinery. The same machinery from her vision. The same vast architecture she'd glimpsed through the Leviathan's resonance field. Everyone saw it. Dreamers and guild guards and civilians and researchers, all looking up. The city stopped flickering. Reality held its breath. And through the fracture, not a body, not a form, but a presence, an awareness, and a specific quality of being observed by something that had been observing for a very long time. Then a new voice entered the resonance mana field that every living person carried. Not the deep resonance this time. Something speaking through it. Older. Exhausted. It said, "He is coming back." And despite everything they'd been told about gods not being real, despite 400 years of secular civic Tidewall, despite all of it, nobody in the city doubted for 1 second what they just heard. Serena went pale and very still. She said, "The seventh god isn't just waking up." Vaelor was confused. "What?" Serena pointed across at the people. "It already woke up." She looked at both of them. The missing villages. The altered records. The disappearing scholars. She said, "The god has been awake the entire time." The silence was absolute. Lyra wanted to understand, "How long do you think it's been up?" Nobody answered. Because the question answered itself if you followed the evidence backward, the reports she'd been reading for months, the anomalies that predated the anomalies, the things that had already been missing when they started looking for them. A brass coin rolled across the cobblestones between them. Then another. Then another. Figures emerged throughout the city. Not dramatically, in the way of people who have always been there and stopped hiding. A dockworker with a coin in his hand. A merchant. A street sweeper. An elderly engineer. A woman who looked like she ran a bakery. All of them wearing the hollow circle symbol somewhere visible. Hundreds of them, everywhere. The old traveler from the beach appeared beside Lyra. Same coat. Same impossible patience. "About time," he said, watching the whole thing beside her. "You've been here the whole time," Lyra said. "We're always here, miss." He looked up at the fracture. "That's not regular, right? So here's where we are." He explained quickly and without editorializing, which she respected. The seventh god, the operator, he called it, not the god, had been awake for over 2 centuries. 2 centuries of quietly erasing civilizations, removing memories, rewriting history. Not as destruction. As management. The entity that lived inside the engine's wound was the thing the operator was managing. Every erased city, every removed memory, fuel. Sacrifice. Time purchased. 2 centuries of this. And it wasn't enough. The wound kept growing. "You and this surgeon. You're important," he said, nodding at Vaelor. He pointed at Lyra. "You can hear the deep resonance." Then he pointed at Vaelor. "You remember what was removed?" Vaelor frowned. "What does that mean?" The traveler said, "The theory both of you have been working on." Lyra and Vaelor went very still. "It might be our best move against all of this upheaval." Lyra's mind went somewhere very quiet. Like her needed a moment to catch up. The traveler kept talking. "You two, together, would have eventually understood what was happening. Would have found this sooner. The god needed more time. So it probably caused the world swap to stall you." The answer kind of made sense, and it made some of what had been going on make sense. It had all been feeling wrong since she noticed the missing villagers. She'd told herself that wrong was what betrayal felt like. Going through all those emotions after leaving the engagement party must have mislabeled and misdirected her gut's feeling. Vaelor's face had done something she'd only seen twice before, once when a surgery went catastrophically wrong and once when he'd confirmed the baseline differential in the Neri patient treatment data, the expression of someone whose understanding was being shaken and who is deciding, in real time, what to do about that. Then the fracture opened fully. And the seventh god opened its eyes. Not with the malevolence of something that wanted to destroy. With the attention of something that had been working alone for a very long time and was now looking at the people it has been working for. That was the part that broke something open in her chest. Not the scale of it. Not the power. The loneliness. Then it was gone and the fracture began closing and the city was still in fractured pieces around them and Vaelor was standing very close and very still. She said, "Vaelor, we'll need to talk eventually but..." "Yes. Later," he said, stepping back. "Right now I need you to tell me everything you found in the marshes. All of it. Walk with me." What followed was one of the longest and most professional conversation of their lives, which is saying something given the year they'd had. It lasted 6 hours and covered everything, the chamber, the sleeping villagers, the journal, the engine, her theoretical methodology, and in the middle of it Kale appeared with updated field readings and Serena appeared with a critical piece of historical documentation, and the four of them standing in a destroyed archive surrounded by desert maps assembled the most complete picture of the situation they currently had. Vaelor had not been idle in the 3 months she was gone. He'd been running pathology on the sleeping villagers who'd arrived in Tidewall in the first wave. He had 3 subjects who'd been in the guild's observation ward for 8 weeks. He'd been working on decoding the new orientation in their resonance field alignment, the same orientation she'd noticed in the chamber, and had discovered that he could finally interpret its output. That it contained data. He pulled out his notes. The fields were oriented towards the engine, that much was consistent with her finding, but Vaelor had gone further. He'd mapped the orientation vectors in 3 dimensions across all 3 subjects and triangulated the engine's location. Precise. She looked at the map. At the coordinates. Vaelor pointed out the obvious, that's under the city. Under everything. She said, I know. I've been thinking about the infrastructure map. The pattern under Tidewall. The resonance conduit layout? I don't think it was designed to just carry steam power. Vaelor understood, no, it was designed for something older. The steam infrastructure was built on top of it. Adapted. Which means the city is sitting on, Serena trailed off. And everyone who established the city knew. And forgot. Or were made to forget. Kale looked at the map, he said, so what's the plan? Serena said, we go to the engine. Kale asked, where is the engine? Serena put her finger on the map. Far north. A region the maps labeled the white expanse in the way that old maps label places they don't know much about. That's where the locks are. That's where the source is. When everyone kept looking at her in awe, Serena explained, the deep resonance has been using that language. Locks. Each point in the engine's containment of the entity. When a lock breaks, more of the entity's influence enters the world. Kale said, how many locks are we talking here? 6 total, Serena provided, based on the tome's documentation. Lyra asked, how many have broken? Serena answered, 2. Here and at the chamber. Vaelor started packing up, that leaves 4. We need to get to the engine before the rest of them go. Nobody argued. Because the alternative was not having a plan, which was worse than having a difficult one. They departed 4 days later. The preparation was meticulous because Vaelor was involved in it and meticulous was his thing, and also because going into the unknown while underprepared was a category of error she'd identified at 19 and had been avoiding since. Their expedition consisted of Lyra, Vaelor, Serena, Kale, a resonance engineer named Tala who had been working on the activated ancient engines and had data none of them could replicate, and another amphibian historian named Pole who had the most complete records on the engine's theological documentation and who had accepted the invitation with the expression of someone who understood exactly how bad an idea this was and was doing it anyway. Vaelor had left something behind before they departed. He hadn't told Lyra. She found out from Tala, who mentioned it in passing. Vaelor had evidently told no one and Tala had witnessed it accidentally. What he'd done, gone to the guild directorate and filed a full account of the South Marsh research, Lyra's original reports, her innovations methodology, the Neri baseline differential work, all of it, with complete attribution. Then he'd resigned his guild position, which was the thing that surprised everyone including Tala, and he'd used his family's legal access to the guild charter to force an inquiry into the attribution practices for the last 18 months of documented work. His family name was Vascari Nobility Third House. Old enough to carry the weight he needed it to carry. The inquiry would take 6 months and would conclude, with the certainty that the guild would find extremely uncomfortable, that Lyra Feris's contributions had been systematically absorbed without credit. It would recommend retroactive attribution and formal reinstatement at a rank above the one she'd left. He would not be there to see it. He had a different direction to go in. She found out about this on the 3rd day of travel, when Tala mentioned it because she thought Lyra already knew. She sat with it for a long time. Then she found Vaelor at the bow of the steam cruiser, watching the ocean, and she stood beside him. She started the talk they'd both been putting off for a while. Why did you give all that up? It wasn't for you to know. It was mine to do, he said. I should have done it the moment I saw how the credits were being recorded. I didn't. That's mine to correct. She leaned against her chair. Give up the guild position? His voice shook when he said, yes. And the family expectations. A pause. He said, though my father's expectations had already been decided anyway, apparently, Grand Surgeon was a disappointment, and voluntary resignation is something worse. She had to get something off her mind. Vaelor, I have one question, was any of it the 7th god? Your silence? That night? A long pause. The ocean moved. He spoke plainly. No, he said it clearly, without softness. That was mine. The arrangement existed before all this mess. There was political pressure from my family for the alliance well before me and you. My father made it public and formal. But my silence that night, watching you walk away and not stopping you, that was my choice. Made badly, for reasons that felt sufficient at the time and that I have now had 3 months to understand were not. She stood up to head back, stopped close to his chair. I needed to know which parts were real. She went back to her cabin. She left him at the bow. She was not ready for the rest of the conversation, and she had learned enough about some of what transpired. She walked away in a better mind space than when she had walked away from him in the rain. Seraphine found them on the second day. Not the expedition, Tidewall. The city was in enough chaos that civil travel was disrupted, and she'd been in Tidewall attending a guild research conference at the time the Dreamers arrived, and she'd been there for what followed, and she was not on the steam cruiser, but she was going to be. A smaller vessel she was on caught up to them on the second evening. Lyra was in the chart room when Serena knocked and said, "You should come up." The smaller vessel pulled alongside, and graceful Seraphine came aboard. She looked different from the woman Lyra had watched step onto the ceremony stage. 3 months different. The public grace was still there in the same degree. She was Vescari nobility. She'd been performing composure since childhood, but something beneath it had changed. Lyra met her on deck. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Seraphine said, "Ms. Feris, I know this isn't the time or the place." Lyra stood straight. "You came anyway." Seraphine was unfazed. "I've been sitting with something for 3 months and I need to say it, and then I'll go wherever you need me to go." Lyra waited. Seraphine said, "I believed it was real." The engagement. Everything. She said it precisely, without asking for sympathy. "I want you to know that. Not as an excuse for whatever pain it caused you. I understand that's not yours to adjust for my sake, but I want you to know that I was put in a difficult place too. When Vaelor called it all off, I spent the better part of 3 months being angry at you both before I understood who I should be angry at." Lyra said, "And who's that?" Seraphine smiled sadly. "Something that manipulated us both into a situation that got stickier to pull out of the more we understood the dynamics of our society." She paused. "I find that focusing my strengths at dismantling those customs have been mildly gratifying." Lyra smiled too, mildly. Seraphine said, "The situation as a whole is rather more than mildly anything. Old men in power tend to have a death grip." A beat. Lyra hated what it meant when she said this, but still she said, "You're good at resonance theory?" Seraphine said, "Yes." Lyra was committed now. "In the last 8 months, you've been researching the southern marsh anomalies. I need your research. And possibly you. If you'd be so kind." Seraphine looked at the northern horizon. She said, "I can suspend sticking it to the old worms for a bit." Kale appeared at the rail and looked between them. He said, "Are we sorted?" Lyra smiled over at him, mostly. He said, "Good. Because the ocean is doing something concerning and I need everyone on deck." The ocean had split. She had heard the phrase used metaphorically, and now she understood it was also literally possible. It was the kind of understanding she would have preferred to develop in a less immediate context. A trench stretched across the sea, miles wide. The water stood on both sides of it like walls of frozen glass, the surface smooth and vertical, defying every physical principle she'd studied. The ship's instruments had stopped working except Kale's, which operated on frequencies close enough to the deep resonance to remain functional. He stood at the rail with his readings projecting something very large. Very deep. Moving upward. Pole the historian sat down on the deck. He said, "I quit." Nobody acknowledged this. Then the deep resonance spoke. "The first lock has broken." The trench collapsed. The ocean returned. The water that had been walls crashed back into a sea that had briefly stopped being a sea. But before it did, in the 3 seconds the trench was open, she saw it. At the bottom. An eye. The same eye from the Leviathan's resonance field. The same eye from her vision. Open. Aware. Not malevolent. Not monstrous. Tired. Lyra said, "It's not attacking us." Vaelor was beside her. Seraphine said, "What?" Lyra said, "The eye. It's not." She searched for the right clinical language and failed and said, "It's exhausted. Whatever it is, it's been doing this for a very long time." Kale looked at his readings. He said, "The movement pattern is consistent. Not aggressive. More like it's surfacing." Vaelor remarked, "That's not reassuring." Lyra said, "I know. But it matters. The thing we're trying to understand seems like it's not trying to destroy anything. It's trying to survive. She thought about the old man's coin. The warning. She thought about the note in the journal. She thought about 4,000 sleeping people pointing their resonance fields downward in unified attention. She said, "We've been treating this like an infestation, something attacking a healthy system." Serena said, "And?" Lyra stated, "What if the system isn't healthy? What if it was never healthy? What if the thing we're calling the disease is the body trying to fix something? Like expelling a virus?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Serena said, "That's either the most brilliant thing you've said on this trip or the thing that gets us all killed." Kale said, "You fancy folk need to figure out which one it is." The white expanse was not a place that wanted to be understood. The maps failed on the second day. The compasses failed on the third. Memory started failing on the fourth. As though the fabric of personal history was being ironed flat. Lyra found she'd wake unable to remember the previous day, not because it was gone but because something had been blurred. She started writing everything down immediately and made everyone else do the same. Every hour. Names, faces, the day's events, key decisions. Pohl had suggested it from the start. He'd done his research in places where the ambient resonance affected cognition and he knew the protocols. She was grateful for him in the way you're grateful for someone who knows something important that you don't. Kale woke one morning and stared at her and said, "You seem familiar." She looked at him. She said, "Kale Dorn. Tideworm Hunter. You've been with us for 3 weeks." He rubbed his face, "Right. Right." He wrote it down. They all wrote it down. Vaelor wrote in the hand he used for surgical notes, Serena wrote in the dense shorthand of a Delver's field record, Seraphine's writing was meticulous and annotated, Pohl wrote in 3 languages simultaneously, apparently as a redundancy measure. The fourth lock broke while they were still traveling and they knew it because the tones changed. Overnight. New entries in no one's handwriting. 3 words. "The engine bleeds." Pohl read it twice. He said, "That's either very bad or very urgent." He thought about it, probably both. They accelerated. The forgotten city appeared on the second week of the expanse. It was on every map. They'd seen it on every map since they left Tidewall. None of them had registered it as worth noting, which they attributed to the strange smoothing effect. It had been there the whole time, visible, and the mind had slid off it like water off glass. The city looked as though it had been paused mid-breath. 80,000 people's worth of furniture, food, infrastructure, all present. No bodies. No violence. The absence of 80,000 people in a space that had been built around them had a specific quality that she wanted to describe clinically and couldn't. It felt like a held breath. A child's journal on a kitchen table. The last entry, "Everyone says the bell is beautiful." Then, "Mother says we're going to sleep." Then a blank page. Not torn. Not water damaged. Simply unused. She read it and stood there for a moment and let herself feel it because she'd learned the hard way that not feeling things is just a delay. Then singing. A little girl in the town square, transparent, present, a memory made locally solid by whatever the seventh god's presence did to places it had touched. She looked directly at Lyra with eyes that were clear and not frightened and asked, "Are you here to wake him up?" Lyra didn't know what she meant. "Who?" The girl tilted her head up. Her eyes glowed eerily. She said, "Too late." The bell rang and the city woke up and they ran. The city dreaming was architecturally impossible and fully committed to it, buildings turned toward each other, streets redirected, the logic of a conscious urban space replaced by the logic of a mind working through the dreamscape without resolution. Kale found the exit by going against every apparent direction, which was correct in the specific way that correct things in impossible situations often are, counterintuitive but sound. They emerged into snow. The city behind them. Then gone. One moment there. The next, snow. Nothing else. Pohl said, "Those were 80,000 people back there." Nobody answered. Serena said, "That's where they went, it's how they move around. The bell takes them. The city preserves them. Then the city goes." Vaelor said, "Where are they preserved when they aren't physical?" Serena said, "We don't know that yet." "I think it keeps them inside," Lyra said. She was thinking about the wound. About what the deep resonance had been showing her, it keeps them inside the seventh god. Stored. Serena looked at her. She said, "The erasure isn't destruction. It's preservation. The god is keeping them somewhere." Vaelor said, "That makes sense." Something that is simply destroying wouldn't preserve. It would just destroy. Kale said, that's either very reassuring or very horrifying. They met. The giant appeared as their next wonder. Miles tall on the horizon. Covered in frost. Still enough to be a mountain, which was what Pole said he was until he moved, at which point Pole's second career-ending clarification was delivered and filed. The giant looked at them across the distance with the unhurried attention of something that experiences time differently. The voice, when it came, moved the snow. Why are the healers walking toward this wound? Lyra stepped forward first. She said, because someone has to. The giant considered this. Then it said, you are too late, the fourth lock had broken. It was done. She stood firm, then we prevent the fifth. The giant looked at her for a long time. Then it nodded. It sat down. And while it sat, while everything was very still and very cold, it told them things. Not with words. Through resonance. The deep resonance, coming through it, showing them. The engine. The wound. The entity inside. And the entity's nature. Not malevolence. Not ill will. Not a consciousness. A process. Ancient, mechanical, unaware of its own activity, consuming possibility the way a fire consumes oxygen, because that was its structure, because it had no other nature. It was not doing anything to the world. It simply was, and what it was had no place for the current world to exist alongside it. The giant faded. Not dramatically. It was simply there and then less there and then not. Kale wrote it all down. They kept moving. The engine was something she had nothing to compare it to. Not because she lacked imagination. Because imagination mostly requires a scale you've experienced before, and she had experienced nothing at this scale. It stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. It was partly mechanical, partly geological, partly biological. The boundary between the machine and the landscape had been dissolved so long ago that the landscape itself was part of the mechanism. Mountains were components. Coastlines were pathways. The resonance field was not a product of the engine. It was the engine's heartbeat. The wound was a whole miles wide in the center of the visible structure. It bled effervescent mana-resonant lines into the surrounding territory in visible streams, pale, fractured, the color of the ether burns she'd treated in the harbor disaster. Lyra looked at those streams for a long time, then she called to Vaelor, the resonant streams from the wound. What do they look like to you? He looked. Then he said, cascade failure. Like a resonance field collapse in a patient, but distributed across. She finished, across an area the size of a continent. And how do we treat resonance field cascade failure? A pause. Then he said, stabilization. Synchronization. Reintegration. She nodded agreement. He looked at the wound. He looked at her. Then he said, the entity is the instability point, it's not the pathogen. It's the symptom. The wound is generating the entity, not the other way around. Seraphine caught on, she said, so treating the entity won't work. You have to close the wound. Kale, ever practical, asked the question they all should be focusing on, how do you close a wound this size? Lyra arched an eyebrow, the same way you close any wound. You bring the edges together. You stabilize the field. You let it heal. Pole said, how? With what? That was the question. Then someone started clapping. He introduced himself as the shepherd. He was a man who looked like no one in particular. His features seemed to morph and shift at his choice. He was dressed simply. He stood at the edge of the wound as though he'd been waiting there for a long time. He probably had. He said, congratulations. Nobody lowered their guard. Kale's harpoon was out. Seraphine's pulled active resonant daggers from her boots. Pole had apparently decided that standing behind Kale was where he'd be most useful. The shepherd spread his hands. He said, I've been working on this longer than you've been alive. He said it without ego, without complaint. The way one said true things that were simply true. Seeing the distrust on their face, he said, let me explain. He explained. The seventh god, the operator, had woken first because it had to. The wound predated the divine order. It had been there since before the engine was built, a structural fault that the original builders understood and contained. The 6 sleeping operators had believed the containment would hold indefinitely if they maintained it passively. The 7th had disagreed and had been overruled. Then the containment began failing. The 7th woke up and did the only thing it could with the time available, it bought more time. Every erased city was fuel fed into the wound to slow its expansion. Every removed memory was energy. Every sleeping villager was a preserved archive, not destroyed. Waiting. The shepherd had spent 2 centuries working alongside the 7th, believing himself to be the last person who understood what was happening. The hollow current had formed around his network of observers, people who found the signs, tracked the failures, kept reality coherent at the margins. For us shepherds, we had arrived at a theory that the solution was never something we could implement. It was never within our reach. Vaelor asked, then whose reach? The shepherd pointed at Lyra. Lyra said, I'm a healer from the flooded districts of Tidewall who learned medicine from an unlicensed river practitioner. How would that help? The shepherd said, because this wound requires integration. Not force. Not power. Not divine intervention. He looked at the wound. The entity that emerged from it isn't something to be destroyed. It's something to be reintegrated, returned to the structure it separated from when the wound formed. That requires someone who understands how damaged systems heal. Vaelor stepped forward. Resonance stabilization. You would need the pathways mapped and held while the reintegration occurs. That takes at least 2 practitioners working in synchrony. Lyra looked at him. He looked at her. The shepherd said held his hands open to encompass Lyra, Vaelor and Seraphine, yes. Before they went into the wound, she found Serena. Serena was standing at the edge of the engine structure, looking at it with the expression Lyra had learned to read over the past weeks, not as analytical, not as afraid. As the expression Serena used for things she was committing to memory. Lyra said, you know something about the hollow current that you haven't told us. Serena didn't hide it, several things. Lyra pressed, will you tell me more? Serena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the hollow current doesn't recruit. The old man giving you the coin was the first voluntary recruitment in their recorded history. I've been trying to understand why. Lyra waited. Serena said, I think it's because this is the first time the deep resonance and the engine have reached for someone who wasn't already attuned to their system. Previous occurrences has been internal, hidden, operators, shepherds, people who understood the engine because they were part of it. She paused. You're not part of that life, so you can see it from outside. You can see the wound the way a healer sees a wound, not as something that defines the patient, but as something that can be treated. She looked at her. That's not a small thing. Lyra said, what are you going to do after? Serena looked back, I'm going to go find the rest of the tome. There are pages missing. The shepherd knows where they are and won't say, which means they're significant. That's going to be dangerous. Lyra stated. Serena winked, everything interesting is dangerous. She almost smiled. You're not the only one who runs toward smoke. Lyra looked at her. She said, come back. Serena said, I'll find all of you. I always find what I'm looking for. She did not say it dramatically, not with flourish, but as a fact she intended to make true. Lyra liked that. The wound, from inside, was not darkness. It was everything. Every city that had been removed was there, not as ruins, not as memory, as living reality, preserved in the 7th God's field. She was walking through a city that had been erased 300 years ago and it was mid-afternoon and people were going about their days and none of them could see her, and she understood, they were waiting. Not dead. Waiting. She said to Vaelor, they're all here. Kale said, all this time everyone thought they were gone, the god didn't erase them. It kept them. They went deeper. The entity was at the center, which was not a geographical center, more a conceptual one, the point the wound orbited. It was exactly what it had felt like from outside, a process, not a consciousness. Ancient, mechanical, hungry in an inexplicable way that was without intention or malice. She looked at it for a long time. Then she began working. The diagnosis, the entity was the wound's externalized instability. When the fault had first opened, the resonance that escaped had no framework to organize itself within. Outside the engine there was no structure for it, so it had organized around the one thing available, which was itself. Centuries of self-organization had made it autonomous. But it wasn't separate from the engine. It was still attached, still connected at the point of origin. The treatment, guided reintegration. Bring the edges together. Stabilize the resonance field at the point of contact. Let the entity's structure reconcile with the engine's structure. The problem, doing this required simultaneously holding the wound open, stabilizing the entity's field without triggering defensive collapse, and managing the resonance output of the reintegration itself. 3 things requiring 3 coordinated inputs. There were 3 of them. Seraphine said, we need a 4th. Vaelor said, we have Serena. Lyra shook her head, she's not in here. Then the 7th god appeared. Not enormous. not divine. The form it chose was compact and human-adjacent mixture of machinery and flesh, and it looked exactly as tired as she'd felt it through the Leviathan's field. It looked at them, Lyra, Seraphine and Vaelor. It said, "I've been waiting for over 200 years for someone who understood." Seraphine said, "That sounds awfully lonely, I'm sorry." It said, "Don't be. Be useful. We need a fourth stabilization point." Lyra informed it. It extended wires from its chest toward the wound. 4 points. Lyra. Vaelor. Seraphine. The seventh god. The oldest operator and 3 practitioners in Ethres, holding a wound open while the thing inside came home. The entity did not resist. It had never been attacking. It had been trying to return. It was a piece of the engine that had been outside its structure for so long it had forgotten how to fit, and what it needed was not to be destroyed but to be shown the door. They showed it the door. Vaelor and Seraphine held the field borders, the seventh god held the wound edges. And the wound began closing. Lyra had never healed anything she couldn't understand fully, she had never worked at a scale she couldn't physically grasp. Everything she'd ever learned about medicine was based on a body she could read with her hands, a resonance field she could measure with instruments, a patient she could look at and know. This was none of those things. This was the world. She healed it the same way. Across Ethres, things returned. Not dramatically. The way healing returns things, quietly, over time, in stages. The resonance streams from the wound stabilized and then stopped. The memory of the sea came back to Tidewall between one moment and the next, not a wave, not a restoration, just suddenly everyone in the city knew what a harbor was again, and several thousand people looked at the ocean with the specific expression of people remembering something they'd been missing without knowing they were missing it. The dreamers woke up. All of them. In Tidewall, in the ruins, on the plains of the South Marsh. 4,000 people who'd been attending found themselves somewhere unexpected and had a very confusing half hour before the resonance field settling around them started making environmental sense. Pole cried, he didn't mention it, nobody else mentioned it. The glass leviathans returned to the northern sky routes within the month. The forgotten cities, not all of them, not immediately, but they began the process of return. The seventh god's preservation field released them in stages, each one reintegrating into the world's resonance fabric with the careful timing of someone who had been managing this kind of complexity for 2 centuries and knew exactly how fast was safe. And then the sleeping operators woke, not to take over, they'd been managing too passively for too long and knew it. They woke to maintenance mode, the equivalent of practitioners who'd been unconscious in their own ward, returning to check on the patients they'd been neglecting. The shepherd disappeared the day after the wound closed. No one knew when exactly, and everyone decided not to say any more on the matter. 2 months later. The city rebuilding. The resonance infrastructure being recalibrated to the engine's restored field, which felt different now, fuller, warmer, something that generations of Tidewall residents had been compensating around without knowing what they were compensating around. Engineers were finding it everywhere. Kale was finding it in creature behavior, Pole was finding it in historical records that had changed, researchers who hadn't known what they were looking for found it when they looked. The evening before Serena left. She found Lyra in the ward, which still existed, still needed healers, which Lyra found reassuring, that the world having nearly ended didn't exempt anyone from routine post-operative care. She announced, "I found a fragment of the tome. In the archive records." Lyra looked up. Serena set a photograph on the desk. The missing pages. Lyra looked at them. They were signed with the symbol of the shepherd. The content was, she read it and looked back at Serena. "Is this right?" she asked. "The shepherd built the engine." Serena said, "I think so, or helped to, the pages are damaged. That's why he knew everything about it." Lyra said. Serena agreed, "Yes, which means the remaining pages, wherever they are, might contain the original design specifications." Lyra stopped. She hadn't expected that. "Please be careful, Serena." Serena shrugged, "I'm always careful." That was technically true and completely inaccurate in all the ways that mattered, and they both knew it. Serena picked up her coat. She said, "Tell Kale to keep better field notes. I'll want to cross-reference when I'm back." Lyra said, "You can tell him yourself." Serena turned around, "I'd rather make my exit without the editorial commentary." She left. With her typical practicality, through a door, efficiently, with somewhere specific to go. Lyra sat there for a moment. Then she went back to the post-operative notes because the world might have almost ended, but someone still needed to sign off on Aldous the harbor engineer's discharge paperwork. The harbor bridge. Same bridge. Same harbor. The steam engines running cleaner now, the resonance infrastructure tuned to the engine's restored frequency, which made the whole city feel subtly different, something she was more aware of as a rightness that she'd stopped noticing when it was absent and now noticed constantly in its presence. Vaelor found her there. She'd known he would. She hadn't told him where she was. She'd also stopped pretending she wasn't aware of when he was looking for her. He said, "You're late finishing." She explained, Aldous had questions about his discharge diet. He had opinions about what constituted a sufficient answer. Vaelor chuckled, "He's been a difficult patient since week 1. She added, "He's been a difficult patient since the surgery. He was probably a difficult patient before the surgery. I think it's his constitutional state." A pause. She broke the silence. The guild inquiry concluded. "They want to offer me a senior research position. With the attribution corrections." He said, "I heard. They came to me first to ask if you'd be open to contact." She was curious, "And what did you tell them?" He said, "I told them you were the best diagnostic mind I'd ever worked alongside and that whether they got you back had nothing to do with me and everything to do with whether they could make a compelling case." She narrowed her eyes. "That's a very diplomatic answer." He raised his hands, "I've been working on diplomacy." She laughed, "How's that going?" He said, "Terribly. I resigned from the only institution that employed me and then told its directors their attribution practices were structurally corrupt." She said, "That sounds about right." The harbor. The Leviathan somewhere in the upper cloud layer, following routes they'd been following since the resonance was restored, great glass shapes moving through the dark like something the sky kept safely in a dream. Then Vaelor said, "I need to tell you something." "Is this the speech?" she asked. He clarified, "Not that speech. That speech was terrible. I disposed of it." She waited. He went all in. "I spent 3 months being angry about a decision I had no say in and I didn't oppose when I could, and then I spent 3 more months in the white expanse watching you work and understanding that my justification had been wrong before I ever understood why." He paused, "Not because the engagement was a farce. Because what I'd done was mine, and I'd been using the anger at familial pressures to avoid sitting with what I'd actually done." She said nothing. He continued, "I chose wrong. I chose what was easy over what was right, which is a thing I don't do in medicine and a thing I had been doing in every other area of my life for years." He looked at the water. "I'm not asking you to make a decision. I'm asking you to know that I understand the specific thing I did wrong and that I'm not the same person who did it." She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "I've been watching you for a year. Before the engagement, during it, and after. I know who you were. I also know who you've been when you were afraid." A pause. Then she said, "I know the difference." She was not going to make it easy, but she wasn't going to give him a hard time either. If things happened to work them back into that situation they'd been in before, she wasn't going to fight it. Neither of them was ready to resolve it tonight. They were both standing at the edge of it, which was a different position than the one they'd been in before. Now they'd had the talk instead of refusing to look at the harbor, the steam, the Leviathans. She put her hand on the railing. After a moment, his hand covered hers. Neither of them commented on it. Neither of them moved away. One morning Kale appeared in the ward doorway and said, "I have something you're going to want to see." She looked up from the resonance readings she'd been reviewing. "Good something or bad something?" He smiled, his roguish smile. "I've stopped being able to tell the difference." "That's probably a sign." She pulled on her coat. He took her to the harbor. He took her to the dock where the small research vessels moored, the ones used for coastal surveys and creature monitoring. His own vessel was tied there, the one he'd been on when the Leviathan fell, months ago. On the deck was a tideworm. Small. Juvenile. Contained, not in a cage. Kale didn't cage things, he created environments that allowed them to function as close to naturally as possible while contained, in a resonance field enclosure he'd built from his own equipment. "Why do you have a juvenile tideworm on your boat, Mr. Dorn?" He said, "Because I found it in distress in the southern shelf and because its resonance field is doing something that I have not seen before and that I think you need to see." She looked at the enclosure. She looked at the creature. She looked at the resonance field readings on Kale's instruments. The tideworm's field was oriented downward. Toward the engine. Just like the sleeping villagers. Just like the Leviathan, at the end. But the villagers had woken up. The Leviathan had died. The tideworm was alive, and awake, and some attending like the villagers. Its resonance field pointing toward the engine with the focused quality of a creature that understood something it couldn't communicate. Is it responding to the restoration somehow? She thought about Vaelor's surgical notes on the sleeping villagers, cross-referenced with her field observations in the chamber, cross-referenced with Kale's creature data, cross-referenced with Seraphine's resonance theory, building towards something none of them could see completely yet. She thought, this is how it works. Not one person with the answer. A methodology. An accumulated knowledge. People who ask different questions comparing notes until the picture is legible. She said, Kale. He responded, yeah. She said, write everything down. He huffed, I always write everything down. She snorted, write it down better. He made an aggrieved sound. She was already walking back up the dock. She had resonance readings to review, a senior research position to consider, a harbor engineer's discharge paperwork to argue about, and a conversation on a bridge to return to every evening until it resolved into what she was fairly certain it was going to resolve into. She was, for the first time in a long time, walking toward tomorrow. She found she was looking forward to it.